What is up, guys? Welcome back to another GeekaWhat video. In this one, I'm going to be building the ultimate high-end gaming PC build for 2023, featuring an RTX 4090, obviously, a PCI-E Gen 5 NVMe drive, very excited to test this out, and Be Quiet's brand new Dark Base 901 full tower PC case. This is a system that means business. I'm excited to see exactly what this thing can achieve in those all-important benchmarks later on, but first I'll be covering off all the parts that make it possible and how to assemble this system, after a quick word from today's video sponsor. The GeekaWhat Aorus 15 lineup is equipped with the latest RTX 40 series GPUs for top-tier performance. Plus, with display options up to Quad HD 165Hz, this laptop is a great bet for both high-resolution titles and competitive games alike. Plus, with AI-accelerated performance in games, including via NVIDIA's DLSS 3 and a 13th gen CPU that clocks in at up to 5 GHz, you're sure to be well covered in the frame rate department. Learn more at the first links in the description below. Let me start by giving you guys a quick rundown of all the parts that make this build possible and assemble the system as we go. First of those two parts is going to be the motherboard and the CPU. Now, in terms of the processor, this is AMD's Ryzen 7 7800X3D. This is going to be basically the best gaming CPU on the market right now. It's got insane single-threaded performance, and AMD's layered stacked 3D cache really is extraordinary. It's leaps and bounds, currently ahead of what Intel can offer, and provides exemplary gaming performance. If you wanted to do video editing and rendering on this build, jump this up to the Ryzen 9 7950X3D for that extra multi-threaded upside. But for gaming, as I say, this is going to be more than enough. I'll be installing it inside of this, the Asus ROG Strix X670E. When it comes to picking a motherboard for a Ryzen-based system, there are two main chipsets to pick from, X670 and B650. Some chipsets will also have an E designation at the end, standing for extreme. But what this really means is that the motherboards with the letter E on the end come with PCI-E Gen 5 support as standard. That obviously works for both the graphics card but also the M.2 slot, something I will be taking advantage of today for the first time in a build on this channel. I'm very, very excited to test that out. Otherwise though, from Asus, this is a really solid board. I/O is very, very strong, Wi-Fi 6E, plenty of USBs, 2.5 gig Ethernet, not one, not two, but 3 USB Type-C ports with 10 and 20 gigabit bandwidths. It just ticks a lot of boxes. Loads of expansion, DDR5 memory support as standard, of course, here, and of course supports the Ryzen 7800X3D CPU in the AM5 socket. Otherwise though, it's a really solid board. It's got a great set of I/O ports with plenty of USB-C, Wi-Fi 6E. It just ticks all of the boxes that we could need. And of course supports the Ryzen 7 7800X3D, which I'm struggling to unbox. Of course, the massive advantage over Intel at the moment, though the rumored 14th gen may actually use the same socket and same motherboard chipsets, is that this motherboard and its socket are pretty well future-proof. AMD say they're going to release at least probably 3 CPU generations on the AM5 socket, so loads of forward and backwards compatibility on offer right here. The RAM is going to be the next part that I'm going to pop in. I've picked up this 32GB kit of Kingston Fury Renegade. You may want to pop this up to 64 gigs, especially if you're looking to do a lot of multi-threaded workloads on this build, enthusiast workloads if you will, but for gaming, 32 gigs presently is going to be fine. And with 2 slots remaining, you'll be able to easily upgrade this build later to, of course, support 64 gigs of memory. So that's really, really great to see. Very easy to go ahead and slot in. There's one DIMM and our second DIMM just here, a little something like so. Really like some of Kingston stuff, and the silver will help kind of offset the build a little bit. I am going to install the M.2 NVMe drive next up, and this is a little bit special. Now, I've got to give a big shout out to box.co.uk who sent this over for me to take a look at. It's the crucial T700 with a heatsink. Now, if you're unfamiliar with how SSDs work, here's a quick whistle-stop tour. Gen 3 NVMe drives were able to run at up to about 3.5 gigabytes per second on the very top end. Then when Gen 4 came out, we basically saw a doubling of the bandwidth, allowing for 7.5 to 8 gigabytes per second of potential SSD throughput. And while the numbers for the Gen 5 interface aren't actually finalized yet in terms of the top bandwidth, we're seeing up to about 15 gigabytes a second as the maximum speed from any drive. Now this crucial one is of course one of the slightly more early Gen 5 examples, and let's be honest, going to be a little bit more realistic in terms of speeds, and gives us in the region of about 12.5 gigabytes per second of read and potentially write speeds. But as I say, we're going to look at that. We have published a review on the website, at least we will have done by the time today's video is going to be live. Look at this thing. Now the first thing you'll notice is just how big and hefty that heatsink is. It's beautifully designed, and I think we're going to see more and more Gen 5 drives use their own heatsinks just to avoid people installing them in boards where the inbuilt heatsinks aren't sufficient. The one on this Asus board is, so that's good, but a lot of boards aren't going to be. Gen 5 drives, there's a lot of heat there, there's a lot of data transfer, there's a lot of power really for such a small package, but 12 gigabytes per second, that's unbelievable. That's like 100 gigabytes in 8 seconds. Now for this, I'm going to need to pick up my handy new screwdriver set. Currently I've got all of the bits preserved. I'm sure I will have lost half of these bits in a year's time, but that's sort of not the point. And pick a small bit to actually remove the built-in M.2 heatsink. So you can see here, a couple of screws, and this will pop off. Now, we won't be needing to use this, but I'd still recommend you keep it safe. Maybe pop it in the motherboard box in case in future you swap this drive out for one that doesn't have a built-in heatsink or heat spreader. Then the drive slides into the slot like so. Look at that thing. With our toolless mechanism, hopefully enough to actually secure the drive. So a bit of a clearance problem there. Kind of holds, but not that well. Let's remove the built-in sort of thermal compound, if you will, then try adding the drive in, as we shouldn't really need it anyway. Ahaha! There we go. The drive now fits. So just needed to remove this thermal sticky pad, and that allows us for the T700 to be installed. I'll be looking at data speeds on this later during the gaming benchmark, so stay tuned for that. And get subscribed for more future Gen 5 NVMe coverage. It was quite possibly the worst segue I've ever done. Now, the final component to work on while the motherboard is still loose out of the case and has its freedom is the cooling. Now, I'm going to be opting for a 420mm CPU cooler, a liquid cooler, which will obviously be installed into the case, but there is often some prep that we can do now on the motherboard. This particular model is the Corsair iCUE H170i Elite LCD XT. You may have noticed Corsair recently released their new iCUE Link goodies. That's a more digital way of controlling fans and all that sort of stuff. So watch this space, as I think this cooler will very quickly be replaced within the market. But for today's video, it's exactly what we need. Got the screen, we can customize it. Corsair's software is just better than anybody else's. No one else has quite caught up yet. If we open up the cooler box, I want to just dig out all the AMD mounting hardware first and foremost. A quick cursory glance at the manual shows that the installation for AM5 CPUs is actually resoundingly simple. Simply add in these standoffs to each corner of the CPU. So there's 4 holes that poke through the motherboard by default. With AM5, there's no need to add your own backplate in, which makes things quite a lot easier, really. Pop these in one by one, and then the cooler will sit on these later. So it's a very simple bit of prep that needs doing today, but nevertheless is still easier to do before you go ahead and get the motherboard in the case and have bits of metal in the way, stopping you from easily screwing in all of the necessary standoffs. And then the motherboard assembly is complete and actually feeling quite hefty with all the hardware that is on there. The thing to do now is to move it, as I say, into the chassis, and that is where this comes in. Let me pick it up, and as a word of warning, it's very heavy. This is the Be Quiet Dark Base 901, and boy is this a bit of a hefty case. I first saw this over at Computex literally a few weeks ago in Taiwan, and was actually kind of bowled over by some of the features that are built in. So you get this magnetic GPU support mount, which also happens to hide the cables, fairly clever. You get loads of modularity. The motherboard tray can actually be flipped and inverted to have different sort of configs and combinations. The top and front panels can be swapped between mesh and solid for airflow or silence, or ideally a mix of both. It supports 420mm rads in the front, a radiator on the side, a rad on the top. You get Be Quiet's high-end Silent Wings 4 fans included as standard, and the I/O is pretty cool. Not only is there a wireless phone charger on top of the case, why has no one done that before? But there's a touch-sensitive RGB controller, loads of I/O, and it's built like a tank. Is it big? Very. Is it expensive? Yes, quite. But is it pretty cool, and is it great for a high-end build? Absolutely. As with any case, I think the first order of business is to sort of strip it apart a little bit. So I'm going to take off the glass panel already. already. The rear panel is going to be next, so you can see here. When I pull that off, there we are. Look at the sound insulation in there. If you're looking to build like quite a quiet PC that's optimized for silence, this is the panel and the case that you want to buy. And of course, with our large 420mm radiator, we can run fan speeds nice and slow and make sure we have maximum airflow without the noise that comes with it. Just going to remove the vertical GPU mount, have a quick glance at all the standoffs. They look like they're in the right place to me, and slide our Asus motherboard into place. So pop that through there, get it to line up nice and easy. He says while struggling to line it up nice and easy. There we go, marvelous. And then 9 screws, well technically 8 because the middle one is like a blocked off standoff rather than a screw thread, will secure the motherboard nicely into place. The radiator is then the next key component to install. Now it's comprised of a few key elements. We've obviously got the screen on the top, which I believe is, yes, magnetically detachable, so that can be out the way for now. The water block section, which we need to tweak, and then of course the large 420mm rad with the triple 140mm RGB fans. Now in terms of the changes that need to be made, by default this comes with Intel oriented mounting hardware. That's these brackets just here. Take these off and instead add into place these, which are the AM4 and AM5 specific brackets instead. Repeat this for the bottom. They're just friction mounts. They'll hold on nice and easily without too much trouble, and be careful not to damage the pre-applied thermal paste on the bottom of the cooler while we do the next stage. Moving around to the front of the case, and if I pull off the front panel, remove the built-in dust filter, you will see there are a couple of pre-installed fans which need basically removing to make way for the radiator. So unscrew these corner by corner. To make the radiator installation a little bit easier, you can actually remove this bracket here using the 4 thumb screws. They're a bit tight to do by hand, so I'm going to employ the use of a screwdriver instead. And what this bracket will allow is for easier installation of the radiator outside of the case. So pop the radiator into the bracket and use the edge of your table kind of as a bit of a brace, if you will, for the radiator. Then we can add the fans underneath and create almost a bit of a radiator and fan sandwich. That is going to look a little something like this. We can then take the included bag of screws that you get with the cooler, of which you'll find long radiator screws, which will go right through the fan and into the rad, securing this whole thing into the assembly. And then it should, in theory, be a pretty simple case of sliding this in. Let's, of course, make sure all of our wires are out the way. That actually fits perfectly. There's something quite satisfying about that. I'm next going to pop the water block onto the CPU. You'll see it just sits there nice and easily. Add the thumb screws on, and once 1 or 2 thumb screws are on, that's going to stop the water block from moving anywhere. You can see why I've took the screen module off. Make sure they're pretty tight, but don't tighten one all the way and then the other all the way. Do a little bit on each one, bit by bit, to ensure we're not putting any undue pressure on particular corners or sections of the CPU. So you can see here, really quite close now. And you do want to crank these all the way until basically the screw comes to sort of a natural ending, conclusion, or stop, if you will. Looking good. Then the screen module clip back into place. Add that on like so, and I'll be running all the cables out the way through the cable management slit at the top of the chassis. First impressions, this thing looks pretty good. I think I'm going to add the graphics card in next. I have gone ahead and picked up the Asus TUF Gaming RTX 4090. Now, it's the best consumer gaming GPU you could buy. Thankfully, a lot better than basically any of NVIDIA's other recent GPU releases, both in terms of raw performance and its value proposition. AMD, unfortunately, can't come close to this just yet. NVIDIA retain that very, very top spot when it comes to high-end GPUs and, of course, high-end systems. Now, taking a look at the chassis and how we want to install this, I always recommend hovering the GPU over the PCIe slot first. So that's going to show us the card sitting roughly about here. Well proportioned, matches the aesthetic, and I can see that we need to take out a couple of PCIe lanes. Specifically, this one just here and this one just here. Once again, thumb screws that are not really thumb screwable. They're a little bit too tight from the factory, but at least they're not going to go anywhere. That's the first one, and then of course the second one, and then the card should slot into place nice and easily. A little something like, oh no, I was going to say something like so. I've took the wrong PCI lane out. I've took the third and the fourth ones rather than the second and third. So do as I say, not as I do. And then try again to pop the GPU in. That looks a little bit better. Nice bit of pressure. Yes, looking good. Thumb screws can then go back into place once again with the screwdriver. There we are. And then, just as a bit of a reference point for later later on, we've got this GPU support bracket, which I suppose is adjustable. Yes, he says. Yes, I've got it to work. Yeah, baby. Now, you'll see in a bit more detail later on how exactly this works, but it clamps the GPU in like so, and then the cable is going to run in the bracket down the back, and in theory, you won't see it. It isn't going to be to everybody's taste. It does cover up the GeForce RTX text. Maybe we get it to just cover up the RTX text, and that looks a bit less silly. It is a bit wide. I mean, it's very, very sturdy, very solid. Certainly is going to stop any GPU sag, and is, if anything, probably a bit more function over form, which is good to see in a case like this where a well-rounded feature set is at the top of the priority list. So I do like it. It's a little bit different, but it won't be quite for everybody. In order to actually see exactly how that whole power situation works with the cable, we need to pop in the power supply, and that's where this comes in. The Be Quiet Straight Power 12 1000 watts. Now, 1490 build, 1000 watts is about where you want to be sitting. I don't think I'd go any lower, to be honest, even if the 1490 can technically run on a solid 80 plus gold unit. This is their Straight Power 12, 80 plus platinum certified, so you've got top rated efficiency, and of course, fully modular, so all the cables that we could possibly need for this build. More modular cables with the motherboard and all that sort of jazz, and of course, the bad boy itself, the 1000 watt brick of power. Here we go. Look at that. Very, very nice. I actually really like that. All of our modular connectors on one side, and of course, it's a silent fan design, so under low loads, that fan's going to stay nice and quiet. All the cables plug up to the modular interface, but keep safe the ones that you don't end up using, as you may need this in future if you choose to upgrade the build. Right, now this is the bit that I'm slightly confused about, but I suppose, oh, well that was easy. So the bottom of it snaps out, and then the cable, I suppose, sort of goes, oh, injury. Then this goes back on, I think. Then the cable, right, maybe let's put the cable in first. Okay, the cable needs to go in this way. That's pretty cool, good. Then the bracket goes on, kind of hard to show. Then the cover for the bracket goes on after that. Aha, yes, now we're, yes. Oh no. Bit fiddly, but actually very cool because you can't see the cable at all. No one's done that before as far as I'm aware, and I like it. But we've done it! I've done it! And it's time to see first how good this PC looks, of course, in an epic GeekaWhat montage, but then how it performs, and we're also, of course, going to test out our Gen5 NVMe sent over by the kind people at Box down below. I'll rejoin you in just a second. With the build nicely assembled and looking good, it's time to take a look at those all-important performance figures. But before we dive into gaming benchmarks, let's take a look at those speed test results from that nice Gen5 NVMe SSD. We tested the crucial T700 using Crystal Disk's speed test on Windows 11 system. Now, the drive advertises sequential read speeds of up to 12,400 megabytes per second, something we were easily able to achieve with 12,295, basically on the money in terms of what's advertised compared to what we managed to test, while our write speed performance was actually higher than the advertised figure. This is obviously in the easiest of the sequential write tests within the Crystal Disk Mark software, so take it with a slight grain of salt, but nevertheless, these speeds are totally bonkers and set us up for amazing productivity and day-to-day use, but also, of course, solid gaming performance. And let's start off, shall we, by looking at Formula 1 2023 first in our gaming benchmark roster. Here, I tested at 4K using the ultra-high preset with ray tracing on high, DLSS enabled, to really push the limits of this system and take a look at the brand new F1 title and what it's capable of. The build achieved a solid 82 frames per second on average, more than enough for a racing title of this caliber, with strong 90 and 99th percentile results too. Move through to Hogwarts Legacy at 4K high settings, and the build also performed well. 94 frames per second on average was a pretty good showing, and as you'd imagine, a very, very enjoyable gaming experience. Move through to the likes of Star Wars Jedi Survivor, and at 4K high here, the build achieved 73 FPS on average, with strong 90 and 99th percentile results too. As always, all the frame rate data was gathered using both MSI Afterburner's Riva Tuner and NVIDIA FrameView. Fortnite at 1080p next of all, why don't we tune that resolution down and try something just a little bit different? And the build also impressed, 353 FPS on average to be precise. As you can imagine, 90 and 99th percentile results were more than enough for even the highest end gaming monitors, while titles like Apex Apex Legends stacked up well too at 4K high settings, 201 frames per second on average, with consistent frame rates all around. This is a build that really packs a punch, but does so in quite a restrained form factor and in the typical Be Quiet style. If you like this new Be Quiet full tower case, I'll link it down below, and make sure to read over on GeekaWhat.com as we'll have a full review coming very soon. Thanks for watching, and as always, we'll see you in the next one.